The view of the Gurubsar of the Vishnu Society on the reparations of the Netherlands to Suriname.
I would like to respond to the various expressions of some groups from Surinamese and Dutch society when it comes to reparations and their views on slavery, some individuals of which can be regarded as rioters and racists. But oh dear, if a Dutchman says something wrong about a colored person like "oh dear, what do you see, black man," then the turnips are done. Reparations are reserved only for the descendants of first, second, and third generation black slaves and indigenous people who actually experienced slavery, many of whose descendants are no longer alive. Only those born before the 19th century can claim compensation. But the fourth generation, so the descendants of the third generation born from the 19th century, are no longer entitled to reparations. They did not suffer, because slavery had long been abolished. Furthermore, they have passed over to colonialism and hold the religious teachings of their former ruler in high esteem, thus they are bound by them. Since most Surinamese are more religious than the Pope, she must observe the grace rule of her God regarding forgive and let the past rest. After all, it was the will of their God. The Dutch government can, however, subsidize projects in the field of education in order to make it more bearable for the current Surinamese. I would also like to note that slavery has been worked into the hands of whites by various African rogue tribes of which the anti-Black Pete activist Jerry Afriyie is a descendant. When we talk about reparations, the Africans have to pay the biggest part, but they don't have any money. What now? Then it stops. And the Netherlands must pay nothing at all, since the slaves were owned and bought fairly, and one can generally do with property what one likes. That the slaves experienced inhumanity among the Christians on the basis of property rights was pathetic, but who can be blamed for that? The Africans who supplied the slaves? The slave drivers? The VIC or the VOC or the royal family to whom the slave drivers and the aforementioned associations have paid tribute for centuries? Or the Creoles, the half-blood children of the white slave drivers who ferociously mistreated the black slaves on the plantations and who tortured, mutilated, and slaughtered the runaway slaves in the cruelest way? All the aforementioned criminals as well as those of the royal family are no longer alive. So it's done and in the past. For the sake of fairness, I must hereby indicate that the Creoles, that is, the descendants who were born through abuse by the white masters, were 50% descendants of the whites and 50% of the black generation. To this end, these Creoles were leniently exempted by their slave masters from the hard labor on the plantations. The mothers of this half-breed generation were very proud to live close to the house of their masters and mistresses. In addition, they got a job in the white household and were completely provided with clothing, that is the so-called kodo misai, as a reference to the traditional costume of their female master. These half-caste children felt more than the rest of the slave population. They received more or less education, of which a legion was later appointed as a coachman and overseer of the black slaves on the plantations. To this end, these Creoles wreaked havoc like wild beasts, for they were not inferior in cruelty to their white fathers. And the descendants of the Creoles mentioned are still alive today, many of whom are clearly recognizable by their light-tinted skin color, their calibrated haughty behavior, and their gaudy and coquettish behavior. And speaking of slavery, when I look out my window in the morning I see men and women walking around on their way to work who are not always treated well by their bosses. Some people are lucky enough to have a good boss, but that's not for everyone. Look at the current rules set by the government. It's pure modern slavery what they hum with conditions and rules. You are not allowed to do anything anymore, you can only do what they prescribe, and that is just slavery. Sinterklaas must go, fireworks will no longer be allowed, employees have fewer rights and the Dutch culture of the residents is also being systematically taken away from them. It is the government that does it because all the troubles come from there. If people want to talk about reparations, the Dutch government can already start paying the victims of the child benefit in the Netherlands. The return of the children to the family must also be fully compensated, as soon as possible, because those people are still in the shit. There are, of course, still children placed in care who have not yet been reunited with the people they belong to. Instead of starting here in their own country, does the government dare to apologize about times long gone, when none of the victims and perpetrators are still alive? One should first put one's own household in order before looking at the neighbors. That is correct and testifies to a sense of responsibility, but not the other way around. The fact is that the enslaved natives, the so-called Indians, by the land thieves did not stand up for their rights at the time. They have not fought themselves free for any reason but resigned themselves to their fate. And the people that submit to their tyrants will lose more than life and property, then they will die out. And this has also happened. The indigenous generation that experienced slavery has died out due to its apathetic attitude. And because it later turned out that the original indigenous people were weak for the heavy work on the plantations, it was decided to bring black slaves to Suriname. At the same time, the remaining natives who had not yet been forced into slavery were left alone. And the descendants of those survivors, including the Kalinyas, Caribbean, the Loconos, Arawaks, living on the coast, and the Akowirio, Trio, and Wayana, still live under the yoke of the Surinamese neocolonialists. It is worth mentioning that a large group of these indigenous people who have converted to Catholicism are currently crying tears for land allocation and experiencing deprivation and humiliation by the Surinamese government and so on. So, neither the original inhabitants of Suriname nor its descendants have ever been taken seriously. Not then and not today. Written by a Surinamese from times gone by.